When Lady Sophie of Edinburgh stepped out of the spotlight, no one realized she had relinquished something far more consequential than a ceremonial duty. Behind locked palace doors, an ancient envelope was passed. Its contents rewrote decades of royal protocol and handed Princess Catherine unprecedented authority without a single headline. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For months, Sophie's absence from key diplomatic tours was quietly noted by insiders. What was once a predictable calendar of engagements, speaking tours, and Commonwealth visits began to shift and then vanish. She, who had once been considered the Crown's steady hand in foreign diplomacy, simply began declining appearances. At first, it was chalked up to exhaustion, or Edward's increasing need for support. But whispers inside Buckingham told a different story. Sophie hadn't stepped back. She had been instructed, too. That instruction came directly from a man no longer leading with confidence, King Charles himself. In an unannounced afternoon meeting at Clarence House, Charles met Sophie without aides, private secretaries, or witnesses. For nearly 90 minutes, doors remained closed, and no official record was made of what was discussed. But what followed was undeniable. A courier was dispatched later that evening from the royal vault, and a sealed envelope bearing the ancient insignia of the Duchy of Lancaster was hand-delivered into Sophie's private study. Only 2 people were present when she opened it. One was Sophie, the other was her personal chaplain. The expression she wore when she emerged from the room, according to a longtime staffer, was as if she had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. What was in that envelope has since become the subject of fevered speculation, but one phrase was later found scribbled in the margins of Sophie's personal diary. Protocol Swan, activated. For those deep within the royal hierarchy, the mention of Protocol Swan is akin to triggering an emergency code reserved only for the most dramatic shifts in the monarchy's internal balance. And it appears that's exactly what occurred. Because just 3 days after that envelope was opened, Sophie began transferring her foreign contacts to a new intermediary. Not Edward, not Charles, not Camilla, but Catherine, Princess of Wales. Even Edward, usually unshakable in public, seemed disoriented after that week. His speech at a naval ceremony stumbled. He cancelled a diplomatic roundtable in Toronto with less than 24 hours' notice. According to palace aides, he was quiet and unrecognizable. Sources closest to the Crown now admit that Camilla had not been informed of the change until weeks later, after Catherine had already been briefed by senior Whitehall officials, and after several embassies had restructured their internal reporting to include her name directly. Camilla, the Queen Consort, was not consulted. The power had shifted without her consent, and Sophie had made her move in complete silence. But what compelled Sophie to surrender her influence so completely, and why was Catherine the only name whispered in the fallout? While the world focused on Catherine's fashion and silence, few noticed the shift occurring in her schedule, her staff, her reach. Overnight, embassies began redirecting briefings. Royal protection officers were reassigned. A new centre of gravity had emerged, and Catherine was no longer simply preparing to be queen. She was commanding like one. What began as subtle changes soon hardened into undeniable authority. Catherine, once praised for her elegance and restraint, was now surrounded by a corps of diplomatic advisors who had previously served under Sophie. Their sudden transfer to Adelaide Cottage under special clearance sent shockwaves across internal departments. The quiet residence, once symbolic of family life, had become a command centre. Phone lines were rerouted. Access lists were revised. The phrase, classified foreign portfolio, began appearing in palace correspondences, bearing Catherine's initials. Briefings once reserved for the monarch or his immediate representative were now funneled directly to her. Every Wednesday, senior envoys delivered intelligence summaries directly to the Queen-in-Waiting's office, a title that had never existed before. But the label wasn't ceremonial. It came with power. Power to question, to redirect, and most critically, to approve. Her voice became the final check before certain dispatches reached even the king himself. And when a highly confidential memorandum from the New Zealand Foreign Affairs Ministry reached Catherine before Charles had even seen it, the signal was clear. This wasn't an informal evolution. It was a reallocation of sovereign trust. The change did not go unnoticed. Several Commonwealth consulates began, reaching out to Kensington directly, bypassing Buckingham and Clarence House entirely. A memo from Canada's High Commission described Catherine as Her Commanding Royal Highness, a term that had no precedent but was left uncorrected by palace officials. Inside the Foreign Office, a directive labelled Grey Dove was logged into restricted access systems. It carried a Kensington Palace encryption key. When the Home Office demanded to know who had issued it, the origin traced back to a clearance code newly assigned to Catherine alone. Camilla's inner circle was left reeling. The Queen Consort, once seen as the monarchy's stabilizing diplomatic presence, was completely blindsided. Her personal aides had not been looped into the realignment, and invitations to joint events were rescinded or redirected at the last moment. According to one well-placed source, Camilla's senior lady-in-waiting demanded a meeting with Charles, only to be told that certain decisions were, no longer reversible. The phrase used was reportedly, "The structure has moved." This wasn't optics, it wasn't succession theatre, it was a re-engineering of power, formalized by decisions made long before the public ever saw the signs. Because while Catherine remained composed, her influence was spreading through the monarchy like a slow-burning fuse, silent, strategic, unstoppable. And yet this wasn't a mere promotion, this was the unveiling of a plan years in the making, and its roots ran deeper than anyone had guessed. Buried in the Queen's sealed correspondence was a letter marked, "For Sophie and no other." What it contained shook the foundation of the Crown Chamber. A private appeal from Elizabeth II herself pleading for one woman to act, when the time came, and secure the throne's soul. It had arrived under tight security, delivered not by a palace courier but by a decorated intelligence attaché from the Duchy of Lancaster's archive wing, an act reserved only for material deemed too sensitive for standard channels. Weeks before her passing, Elizabeth had summoned Sophie Wessex alone, breaking protocol to hand her the letter without explanation. No aides were present, no records kept. The envelope was wax-sealed with the sovereign's private crest, one used only in extreme matters of legacy. For months, Sophie kept it unopened, storing it behind the family chapel in a locked vault only she and Edward could access. The Queen's death changed that, and so, in a moment of unbearable silence, she broke the seal and stepped into a truth that would redefine the future of the monarchy. Its contents remained hidden from the public until recently, but whispers inside the inner court now confirm that what Sophie read that evening left her shattered. A royal valet, long considered trustworthy and now retired, leaked fragments of the letter's phrasing. Among them, "Protect her. When silence surrounds her, act." Elizabeth's plea was not about ceremonial succession. It was about safeguarding the soul of the monarchy from forces she feared would exploit its weakest hour. Catherine, she wrote, was more than a consort in waiting. She was the last reflection of the Crown's moral light, and if her path was blocked by tradition, pride, or power, then it was up to Sophie to clear it even without permission. The letter mentioned two chilling directives, Clarion Protocol and dual stewardship. The first, an emergency provision dating back to the Second World War, allowed for informal authority to be vested in someone outside the sovereign if the monarchy faced internal paralysis. The second referred to a joint protective mechanism, Elizabeth and Sophie, hand in hand, acting as guardians over the monarchy's emotional continuity. But the most devastating revelation came in a single, decisive paragraph. If Catherine was ever politically silenced or strategically sidelined, Sophie was ordered to bypass the Privy Council, the palace's legal advisors, and even the reigning monarch if needed. Elizabeth had anticipated resistance, and she had made a plan to overcome it. What Sophie endured after reading the letter was, according to sources close to her household, an emotional collapse. She did not speak for hours. Her eyes remained swollen for days. Her valet's whispered account described her as a woman grieving not just a queen, but the burden she had inherited in silence. But she did not retreat. Instead, she began acting calmly, methodically, ruthlessly. Within 2 weeks, Catherine's name began appearing on internal routing memos. Weeks later, she was moved into foreign briefings. And soon after, diplomatic authority began shifting beneath the surface like a tide that could no longer be held back. What followed wasn't just duty, it was strategy born of a queen's dying foresight, and the next act would take aim at one of the most powerful figures in the palace. Queen Camilla had weathered press wars, royal divorces, and palace intrigue. But this was a quiet coup. When she learned of Catherine's diplomatic assent not from Charles, but from a foreign ambassador, her fury detonated in private and then spilled into confrontation. The call came from a trusted ally in Brussels, congratulating her on Catherine's poised handling of a recent meeting with NATO liaisons. Camilla, caught entirely off guard, paused before responding. That silence, as one staffer later put it, was the calm before the collapse. Within hours, she had summoned Charles to Birkhall. What unfolded behind closed doors that evening would send fault lines through the very heart of the monarchy. Camilla's voice, usually measured and cool, reportedly trembled with rage. Not only had Catherine assumed a role the Queen Consort had carefully cultivated for years, she had done so with the King's blessing, behind her back. Charles, cornered, responded not with resistance but with deflection. He invoked Elizabeth's wishes, repeating the phrase like a shield. He referenced a sealed document. He spoke of legacy, of trust, of timing. But to Camilla, it sounded like betrayal. Her grip on diplomatic relevance, the very thing that had allowed her to rise from scandal to sovereign, was slipping away. She demanded clarity, control, reversal. She insisted that Catherine's new authority be rescinded, or at the very least, reined in. But Charles remained still. His refusal wasn't blunt. It was worse, quiet, bureaucratic, final. "It's already in motion," he said. "This is the future Elizabeth wanted." In the days that followed, Camilla's bitterness began leaking into the fabric of royal life. A secret recording surfaced its authenticity, never officially confirmed but widely believed. In it, Camilla can be heard saying, "I will not be erased, not by her, not by Sophie, not while I still breathe in this crown." The words weren't shouted, they were whispered, and that made them even more dangerous. Her fury, once confined to private corridors, had become a quiet war against 2 women she believed had outmaneuvered her. Sophie's name was dragged into every discussion, every suspicion. "You chose her over me," she allegedly spat at Charles during a second confrontation, referencing the Duchess of Edinburgh's shadowy role in transferring power. What stung more was not just the betrayal, but that it had been done so cleanly, so invisibly, with not a single headline to warn her it was coming. Behind the scenes, tensions spiraled. Senior staffers began choosing sides. Royal aides defected from Camilla's office to Kensington. Plans for joint appearances were cancelled under the excuse of scheduling conflicts. Even William, previously neutral in internal affairs, was said to have stood firmly behind his wife. The Queen Consort had spent decades building her influence, repairing her image, and controlling her narrative. But now, none of it seemed to matter. She wasn't being pushed out by scandal or public disgrace. She was being replaced by competence, by quiet strategy, by legacy. But the fury of a queen was no match for what came next, a strategic masterstroke that left the entire royal structure stunned. There had never been such a title because the monarchy had never needed one. Now, under Protocol Clarion's reactivation, Catherine was declared heir sovereign, a pre-queen role with all ceremonial and diplomatic weight. Camilla remained queen consort, in name only. The moment the title was whispered within the crown chamber, everything changed. What had been a silent transfer of influence became a public realignment of royal hierarchy. Protocol Clarion, buried deep in wartime royal documents, had been conceived during the darkest days of 1942. It was designed as a failsafe, a framework for reassigning sovereign authority when the monarchy could not wait for death or abdication to act. For decades, it remained dormant. Now, it had been reactivated, and with it came powers the public could scarcely imagine. Catherine was no longer the Duchess of Cambridge or the Princess of Wales in practice. She was sovereign in waiting, commanding with full operational weight. For the first time in living memory, the term heir sovereign appeared in official Crown Chamber logs, words that had never graced any royal document before. It was a role constructed in urgency but implemented with precision. Catherine's new crest, discreetly unveiled through palace stationery, bore the sovereign's gold and was bordered with twin lions. There was no formal coronation, but the message was louder than trumpets. She had stepped into the monarchy's central force, not as a placeholder, but as a power unto herself. And the world responded. Foreign dignitaries began addressing her in private briefings as Your Majesty in transition. Diplomats who once sent their reports to Charles or Camilla were now instructed to send them directly to what palace sources now called the Sovereign's Office. An internal memo never intended for public release was leaked in a brutal act of palace defiance. In it were 12 chilling words. All briefings shall pass through the Sovereign's Office until further royal notice. Charles had not objected. Camilla had not been consulted. The memo was dated 3 days after the Sandringham standoff, and insiders believe it was signed with Catherine's private seal. But the shock did not end there. Weeks later, Catherine convened a private meeting at Clarence House with Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, both of whom had grown distant from the crown after years of being sidelined. What was said behind those doors remains tightly guarded, but what followed left the court reeling. Both women were seen leaving the meeting visibly shaken, with Eugenie in tears. Neither has publicly commented, but one source close to the Duke of York claims, Beatrice whispered afterward, she knew everything. Everything we thought they'd buried. This was not a symbolic title. It was a throne before the throne. And for Camilla, it was a final blow authority pulled out from under her feet by the very institution she thought she had mastered. But for Catherine, it was a moment not of triumph, but weight. She hadn't asked for the crown to tilt in her direction so soon. But it had. And now, it sat in her hands quietly, firmly, unshakably. Yet with newfound power came fresh betrayal, and one woman's silence was about to shatter in spectacular fashion. For years, Sophie Wessex remained the palace's silent strength, but in a rare and unsanctioned interview with a foreign diplomat's wife, Sophie revealed fragments of the truth, her fears, her guilt, and the promise she made to a dying monarch. The conversation took place far from British soil, during a diplomatic reception in Copenhagen, where protocol was relaxed and cameras were forbidden. The event, meant to honor trade partnerships, quickly became the backdrop to something far more personal. Sophie, who had always carried herself with quiet dignity and discretion, was seen stepping aside with the Danish ambassador's wife, her eyes visibly red, her voice hushed but trembling. Those nearby caught only murmurs until one phrase, clear as crystal, pierced the noise. I did what I had to. She needed me to, and I will not regret it. It was not a statement made for headlines. It was a confession. And it would echo across Europe's royal circles before the night was over. The admission confirmed what many had only speculated, that Sophie had acted not out of ambition, but obligation. In her own words, Catherine had never asked for this. She had never sought power. According to Sophie, Catherine only ever wanted to serve, not to rule. But when service demands strength, someone must step aside to let her lead. That someone had been Sophie. And the strength she referred to had been forged not in strategy meetings or public engagements, but in the final hours of Elizabeth II's reign. Sophie spoke openly, albeit carefully, about the late Queen's final directive. She did not read it aloud, nor did she disclose all its contents. But what she did say removed any doubt. The Queen asked me to act, if silence became a weapon. She feared a day would come when Catherine's loyalty would be used against her. That day arrived sooner than any of us expected. To many within the crown, her words struck at the heart of the crisis. What the palace had tried to frame as a natural evolution of royal roles now had a voice, a purpose, and a defense. Sophie denied there had been a coup. This was not a takeover, she stated plainly. This was a correction, a return to what was always intended. Her voice cracked, according to one attendee, when she added, "It broke my heart to do it, but it would have broken hers to be left unprotected." The woman who had once stood as the monarchy's most understated figure now emerged as its moral compass, facing the storm she had quietly carried for months. The interview, though never formally acknowledged by the palace, was soon verified by multiple sources in diplomatic circles. Sophie returned to the UK immediately afterward. She offered no further comment, but the impact of her words lingered in corridors from Copenhagen to Kensington. She had made her peace with the past, but in doing so, reignited the present, because her truth didn't just vindicate Catherine, it exposed every fracture beneath the throne. But while Sophie shared her truth abroad, a brewing storm at Sandringham would drag the rest of the family into the fire. A rare winter gathering at Sandringham exploded into a royal standoff. William stood behind Catherine. Anne backed Camilla. Charles remained motionless. And in a single moment, the monarchy faced an impossible choice: unity or fracture. The meeting had been quietly convened under the guise of a succession clarification, but every attendee knew what it truly was: a reckoning. Charles, fatigued and visibly conflicted, had called his closest family members into one room in hopes of restoring balance to a royal structure that had tilted too far, too fast. What followed instead was an eruption. Camilla, seething over the formalization of Catherine's heir sovereign status, made her move first. With her voice steady but sharp, she demanded an immediate limitation on Catherine's newly granted title. "The optics are unbalanced," she argued. "This office, this authority was never meant to bypass the consort." Her words were met with cold silence from William and a single raised eyebrow from Catherine, who remained composed but unyielding. Then Princess Anne, the ever-loyal traditionalist, stepped in not to defend Camilla, but to defend the institution. She warned against rewriting centuries of ceremonial order based on internal sentiment or emotional preference. "It's about the crown. It must remain untouched by interpretation." Her tone was restrained, but her meaning unmistakable. The implication was that emotion, not duty, had driven recent decisions, but it was William who finally shattered the silence. Rising from his chair, his voice cracked not with anger, but with the weight of exhaustion. "She's earned more than any of us ever were given," he declared, gesturing toward Catherine. "Not through privilege, through resilience. And if that threatens anyone here, then maybe the problem isn't with her." The room froze. His gaze shifted from Camilla to Charles. "If you move to reduce her role now, I will step back entirely." Publicly. Without hesitation, no one spoke. Even Anne looked stunned. Charles, who had remained motionless for nearly the entire discussion, offered no defense, no decision. He simply stood, turned away from the table, and walked out of the room without a single word. That exit, quiet as it was, spoke louder than any decree. For the first time since the reign began, the king had not chosen a side, he had abandoned the battlefield. And in his silence, the family fractured. No agreement was reached, no titles were rescinded. The gathering at Sandringham ended not in unity but in ambiguity, and the damage was irreversible. Outside the estate walls, public sentiment had already swung decisively in Catherine's favour. Her quiet dignity had become a rallying symbol. The tabloids, once obsessed with her wardrobe, now echoed with phrases like "prepared," "measured," and "destined." The palace had lost its grip on the narrative, and the people had already crowned their next sovereign in spirit. There was no need for a formal decision anymore, the family had made it for themselves. But the true cementing of Catherine's place wouldn't come from a vote, a title, or a confrontation. It would come from something far older, something waiting in the shadows of legacy. Because with the family split and public sentiment surging behind Catherine, the final act would arrive not through diplomacy, but legacy. Tucked inside the sovereign's vault, next to Prince Philip's private instructions, was a hidden codicil unopened until Catherine crossed a threshold laid out decades ago. Its unveiling confirmed the unthinkable. Elizabeth's vision had always centered on one woman, and she had left the blueprint behind. The vault review was part of a routine archival clearance triggered by the passing of certain constitutional milestones. What began as a standard legal audit quickly transformed into a bombshell discovery when a royal archivist stumbled upon a sealed envelope labelled in the Queen's unmistakable hand. The label read only, "To be opened upon the full assumption of unofficial sovereign duties by the consort of the heir." The criteria were vague, almost prophetic. But there was no question that Catherine's rise, through quiet force and public devotion, had met them. The codicil's timestamp, perhaps the most chilling detail, was dated precisely 15 years to the day after Catherine's wedding to Prince William, a detail no one could ignore. Inside, in Elizabeth's own script, was a declaration that eclipsed every legal maneuver made in the previous year. She wrote of her desire for a direct transition of authority to the consort of the heir under extraordinary circumstances, if the Crown's moral authority was at risk, or if the traditional structures proved too slow to adapt. The language was elegant but absolute. It granted powers typically reserved for monarchs, placing them temporarily in the hands of one who had not yet worn the crown, but who had already been tested by its weight. The implications were staggering. The codicil described a temporary suspension of consort hierarchy, effectively removing all precedents typically held by the Queen consort in favour of the heir's partner. That meant Camilla's role, while publicly unchanged, had been symbolically overtaken in the eyes of the monarch long before public tensions surfaced. Even more shockingly, the document was signed and notarized with 3 witnesses, one of whom was the late Princess Margaret, who had herself urged Elizabeth in private writings to protect the line by choosing the heart, not the throne. It was a line repeated in the codicil's closing sentence, one that would be quoted for generations to come. If she proves worthy, she must reign in heart, before crown. The release of the codicil sent a silent ripple through the palace. No press release followed, no official statement acknowledged it, but internally, it changed everything. The decision had not been Charles's, it had not been Sophie's, it had not even been Catherine's, it had been Elizabeth's, written in the ink of finality, structured by legacy, and timed with surgical precision. Every move Catherine had made, every burden she had carried, had been building toward this buried truth, and once unearthed, no one could argue with its legitimacy. It wasn't just a passing of roles. It was a revelation of purpose, scripted long before power changed hands. But what Catherine did next shocked even her staunchest allies, and proved she understood exactly what this moment demanded. With the world watching, Catherine stepped into the breach and issued a directive that silenced even her critics. It wasn't a ceremonial order. It was a heartfelt command that redefined what royalty means in a fractured age. After months of whispers, tension, and unseen maneuvering, she finally spoke not with vengeance, not with entitlement, but with clarity and vision. Standing at the apex of a monarchy teetering between history and evolution, Catherine didn't assert her power through tradition. She redefined it through action. Her first public move was a direct communication to all royal departments. From that moment forward, she would personally oversee every arm of the Crown's diplomatic efforts. No gatekeepers, no intermediaries. Her name would sit atop every document concerning global engagement symbolically and operationally. For the first time since the reign of Queen Victoria, a future Queen consort had assumed control of the monarchy's outward voice. But she didn't stop at structure. Catherine's first decree was surgical in intent and global in reach. She moved to re-establish humanitarian aid channels that had been severed during the political upheavals of Brexit. Trade zones that had grown silent were suddenly re-engaged. Cultural exchange programs frozen by red tape were revived within days. From Ghana to Canada, leaders began to speak not just to the British Crown, but to Catherine directly. She was building bridges with steel resolve and velvet strategy. And then, in a moment that stunned even her inner circle, she named Sophie as the senior advisor to the sovereign's diplomatic office, elevating the woman who had once carried the burden of secrecy into a permanent, public role at the heart of foreign affairs. It was a gesture rooted in loyalty, strategy, and deep emotional recognition. In an even more daring stroke, Catherine extended an olive branch to the one woman the palace believed she would never embrace. Camilla received a formal invitation to co-chair the first Royal Reconciliation Summit for Commonwealth women. The summit was Catherine's brainchild, designed to restore fractured relations between the royal household and female leaders across the Commonwealth who had felt dismissed, diminished, or disregarded. The gesture shocked insiders. But Catherine's message was unmistakable. The monarchy would not move forward divided. She would not lead by erasure. She would lead by healing, even if that meant including the one who had fought hardest to block her rise. When Catherine delivered her keynote at the Royal Advisory Council, a room historically dominated by men, something extraordinary happened. As she finished her address on responsibility, restoration, and reign without entitlement, every woman in the chamber rose in unison. They applauded not the position, but the person. They saw a woman who had been tested, broken, rebuilt, and had emerged not just as a royal, but as a sovereign of spirit. The tabloids the next morning didn't hesitate. "Queen before the crown," read the headline in bold print, accompanied by a rare editorial declaring that Britain no longer needed to wonder what kind of monarch Catherine would be. She had shown them. No coronation, no crown, and yet she had already begun to reign. And just like that, history shifted not with a crown, but with courage. Catherine had commanded, and the monarchy obeyed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.